Hey, it's Ryan back with another great special edition of the Bluffton Buzz, in part with the Greater Bluffton Chamber of Commerce. We are doing some interviews of the candidates running for our different districts here in Beaufort County, Bluffton, and South Carolina in general. So, Kate Creech, thank you for joining me, ma'am. You're next on the list.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, Kate, as I told you, very just introductory conversation. We want to get to know you. Tell me about Kate Creech.
Sure. So, of course, my name is Kate Creech. I am running for South Carolina House District 120. A little bit about me, I am a South Carolina native. I did move away for a little bit of time, well, actually a decade. I finished school in Chicago and slowly migrated back to South Carolina. Oddly enough, I moved back in 2020. So that was an interesting year. But my sister was pregnant with her first child. So that did give me an opportunity to spend a lot of time with her. My background is in business. I went to school for marketing and management. So I've done a lot of different things from managing stores to working at a wedding venue. I also had a stint where I worked at the Hayward House, which was a really great experience working for a nonprofit. I'm an aunt, which is great. And I feel like I'm definitely involved in our community. It's something that's really important to me. So that's just a little bit about who I am.
Perfect. I appreciate that. Now, when you were up in Chicago or before you left to go there, were you ever involved in any political arena?
So when I moved to Chicago, I think that really gave me a chance to spread my wings. I was only 19 years old, which of course my family was a little apprehensive about. But I do believe that that was the perfect time for me to be there. I was really able to come into my own. Chicago is quite the melting pot with diversity. So I was able to start to form my own thoughts and have the chance to see the world around me. And that's when I started to become more political. That's when I started dipping my toes in being an activist and really paying attention to not just what was happening around me in Chicago, but what was happening in our nation.
Okay. So when you came back down here in 2020, you started getting reacclimated into the South Carolina life. At what point did you say, I want to run for a seat? How did this work?
So I'd started thinking really before I moved back, just with how I started to really pay attention to politics, that there was a future for me in politics. Now, whether that meant running for state office, whether that meant running locally, I wasn't quite sure yet. But after what we saw with the 2020 election, and especially what we saw a couple of years later with the overturning of Roe, that's when I realized it was time. It was time for me to do something. And then I was actually asked to run, after talking to several people, and I realized now was the time to do it. Someone needed to step up. And I did feel like I was ready. I knew that as a first timer, it was going to be a learning experience. But I'm so glad that I did take this leap of faith because now I'm able to be a voice for so many people that feel like they've been silenced. And it is scary at times, but having the confidence in yourself and knowing who you truly are has been able to really propel me into this and not be afraid to really speak up and speak my mind and be an advocate.
Well, it sounds like self-awareness,
Mhm.
knowing who you are is an important step in this. What other core values do you have that you feel like help you, and how do they like influence your decision-making process?
Sure. I think life experiences have a lot to do with it. Even from my childhood, you think back on what got you to this point, and I think also not not being afraid to be completely honest. I think transparency is something that's very much lacking. I think it's something that we see when laws are being made, where you may say one thing and you may act as though you support something and then you vote against it. So that's something that is very, very important to me is being honest. Also, empathy. I think a lot of people don't know how to have empathy. And I'm not saying you have to be an empath. That is
Mhm.
definitely a personality trait that not everyone has. But you
Right.
have to have the ability to remove yourself from the situation and put yourself in someone else's shoes and take a step back and listen. Listen to what's happening in their own lives and then think, if it were me, how would I want someone to represent me? And then listen to what they're saying and try to put that into action to be supportive.
Absolutely. I think something that takes it one step further too is whenever this is coming from me, whenever I have a firm stance against whatever somebody else is saying, or I completely disagree with them, I will still put myself in their shoes empathetically and be like, well, how did they come to this conclusion? Because you got to realize you're not always right. Right. So it's
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
that is such an important part of dealing with people, I feel like. So I'm glad you talked about being empathetic, because we as a country just, it's either we're right, our group's right, everybody else is wrong, our way or the highway. That gets us nowhere. That gets us where we've ended up, right? So I feel
Right.
like being empathetic to not only the voices you want to hear, but the voices you can't stand hearing at the same time, if I could put it that way. I think it's such an
Sure.
important thing to communicate in a conversation like this for anybody listening, and it doesn't, and that's not political. That could be at your dinner table,
Mhm.
that could be your family, that could be your neighbors. It will go such a long way working in an empathetic way.
Mhm. Yes, I
So
completely agree with you. And it's a
yeah,
humbling thing too. You really have to humble yourself because if everyone's wrong, then no one's right. So,
absolutely.
you know, mm.
I totally get it. So listening to people, you seem to have been doing a lot of that. You've done activist work, so you know what you're doing there. For our areas, in our district specifically, what do you think our top issues are that we need help with and you want to work with?
So there are a lot, but to try to condense it down into three, I think first and foremost is our infrastructure and growth. We know that our area, our county, and up the East Coast, all the way up to Myrtle Beach, is growing substantially. So, what does that mean? Our infrastructure is in jeopardy. We
Mm,
see it when we're driving around town with traffic. We see it um, when you're trying to go somewhere and there's not a lot of parking. But one of the biggest things that I don't think people realize is that there are over 3,000 counties in the United States. And Beaufort County is the number one that is in the most jeopardy with climate change and rising sea levels. Now, the second biggest income in our state is hospitality, which comes from this East Coast area. So, what's to happen as these sea levels rise and all of that hospitality industry is in danger? You walk down where we were originally going to have our
yeah.
interview yesterday, but to the All Joy boat landing, and you see this beautiful scenery. People flock here not just to visit, but to move because of the low country way of life, because of how beautiful it is to live here. But if we don't start focusing now on the impacts of rising sea level, we won't have that anymore. Secondly, healthcare. That's something that affects everyone, no matter who you are. But expanding Medicaid, we have people in this area who can't afford the healthcare that they need, and so we have the money as a state, so we need to expand Medicaid. We need to be able to support the people that need this healthcare so that they don't end up with extreme medical debt. And that is centrally located here, but of course also throughout our state. And I think another thing that affects our community that a lot of people are a little touchy to kind of speak about is safety. So, public safety surrounding common sense gun laws. I'm not saying that we need to go back and rewrite everything, but we need to have some reform, common sense, not nonsense. And along with safety and supporting the public is our public schools. We need to really look at truly investing in our public education, we need to pay our teachers. 90% of children go to public schools. They need to have a fair chance at getting the education that they deserve.
How do you think we can? Now, you mentioned all great topics here, and I think the one, I can selfishly speak on it because I have two young kids. And how do we get the teacher thing figured out better? How do we get better pay for the teachers? How do we improve our school systems so they are more attractive for parents to want to take their kids to these public schools? Because right now, I hear a lot of parents saying they're kind of dodging them. They're trying to go other places. How can we make? I'm a public school kid. I think I came out okay. How do we get back to like where public schools are good, or in air quotes they're good, right? How do we get that perception going?
Well, I think it does all come back to investing in our public schools. We're at a crisis point in South Carolina for a lack of teachers because they can't even afford to live and support their families with their teacher salaries. So you have to think about paying our teachers what they deserve means we can have more teachers, which means classroom sizes are a little bit more under control.
Mhm.
Investing in these schools, I mean, you look at some of the schools in Beaufort County and the infrastructure, you look at how more schools are being built because of our population, but we need to be able to go back and look at these schools who need serious maintenance. And also with our children, we need to be able to support them by using the money that our state has, taxpayer dollars to go back into these schools in order to provide the standard of education that they deserve. And especially with history, they need to be able to learn the full history. They need to be able to have their own original and independent thoughts, but none of that can happen unless the money is invested in these schools. So, of course, I'm not a parent, but I would say the majority of my friends are parents. And so they are slightly deterred from going to public schools because these schools are crumbling because they're not getting the funding that they need.
Yeah. Walk me through it, Kate. Let's just do a hypothetical. How do we start getting the funding to get this rolling? Like, do you have an idea? And I'm not saying you're running on it, but we're just kind of having a conversation about it. Like, how would you do it?
Well, that's a state level. That's
Okay.
definitely something that I would take to the state house.
Okay.
You look at the voucher program, which our Supreme Court did rule against.
What
I
is the voucher program?
So the voucher program takes public tax dollars and
Mhm.
invests in vouchers so that you can apply for a voucher to go to a public school that you may not be, or a private school when normally you may not be able to afford it.
Mhm.
And don't get me wrong, I am not saying I'm against private education at all,
Mhm.
but money should not be taken from public education funds to then be applied to private schools. So that's something at a state level. That's something that did pass, but then it went to our Supreme Court and it was overturned.
Mm.
But this is also a bill that's going to come back up next session. So that's where someone like myself is going to advocate for those public tax dollars to stay where they're supposed to stay.
Got it. See, I didn't know anything about that, and I appreciate you
Sure.
just
And
kind
there's
of
so much
updating
more involved in that.
for sure.
But that's kind of like that's the basics. That's the basics of it.
Something else you touched on was our infrastructure, which, and I said this last year during the interviews, very wide word. Infrastructure can mean a lot of things, but I
Yeah.
think one thing that we need to focus on is our roadways and safety. And I just can't believe the constant accidents that we're seeing. Like, it's insane for this small town in this small area. And are you part of the bad drivers page? Do you know of that group on Facebook?
Yes, and the boat ramp fails.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's just unfortunate. It's like
It is.
It's insane. There's always a backup. There's always an accident. 170 and 278. I was talking to Logan Cunningham. He was explaining, there's some things locally where they might do some cut through roads they're going to propose. Like, what is your take on how we create a safer roadways?
So to your point, last year, I don't know what the new statistic is, but last year there was a statistic that the 95 corridor that brings you into this area, there's around 40,000 cars that go back and forth. That same number of cars come back and forth up and down 278 every day. That's people who may live in Savannah and come here to work. That's people who live here and may go elsewhere to work.
Mm.
That's, tourists. That's people that are coming to visit families. So I think it's a very complex issue and there's no one way to fix it, but it's something that absolutely has to be addressed. And something that I think people also don't understand, they'll go to the town and I understand it's not necessarily a complaint, but it's a concern. But what we have to understand is that the town doesn't own 46.
Right.
So a lot of these issues have to be addressed at the state level with SCDOT. So investing in our infrastructure is something that is very important. I'm not sure if it means more lights. The idea of cut through roads, sure. But what is that going to mean to the environment where these cut through roads may be happening? So that's something where I think compromise is a very big word and we have to
Mm.
evaluate from the bottom up. You may have the solution of cut through roads, but you've got to go down to the very bottom and see, well, what kind of impact is that going to have on the area? There are solutions out there, but we have to be able to come together as a group to find what's going to be best for this area because we know it's an issue. It's a very, very
Yeah.
big issue.
D- there's the issue of that balance, right?
Mhm.
You have human lives, you have protecting the environment. How do you go out and ask people what matters to you? Do you say, I'm Kate Creech and this is what I believe and this is what I'm going to really advocate for? How do you go about picking and choosing? And again, they're both very important. Human life, environment. You can't
Mhm.
you can't really like make the right decision. How do you
Mhm.
go about making that decision?
Well, I think community forums are really important because I think you need to, like you're saying, you need to be able to hear from people. It's not something where those in power I don't think that they should just be able to be the decision makers. So I think it is very important to speak to people and, ask them what's impacting you the most? What are you seeing every day? I mean, and we know there's going to be a lot of similar responses, but being able to hear from the people that are experiencing it every day and what their concerns are, what they may think could be a resolution, that is very important because as someone who wields power, it's not about us, it's about taking those concerns to the state house to be able to form something that serves everyone.
What forums, I'm very big on the communication part. Like what forums have you been going to listen to folks? Or let me ask you a different question. You win November 4th, you're in
Yeah.
office. How do people communicate with you? How do you communicate with them? How does that communication work?
Sure. I mean, I believe in open lines of communication. Of course, you're not going to be able to immediately get in touch with someone, but there's the follow-up. People can reach out to me whenever they would like, whether it's email or a phone call. Forums that I've attended mostly involved because I live at the end of Alljoy, which is a high flood zone.
Hmm.
And even if there's no rain, if there's a king tide and a full moon, which a king tide is significantly higher than your normal tide. With the May River, your average tide is around 8 feet. A king tide, you're going to see around 10 feet. So I can walk out, granted, the little house that I live in is a little bit above ground, or higher off, not in a flood zone. When I walk down into the street, I might be in shin deep water. So some of the forums that I've been attending are concerning the All Joy area and how do we protect this area? How do we address the flooding? A lot of us are on septic tanks down here. So you have to think about when that water comes in and when the water goes back out. So it's not just infrastructure of our roads and that sort of thing. It's about our waterways and protecting those waterways. So those types of forums are really important to me, and hearing from people who live in those areas and are experiencing it. And so for me, attending them, it's educational. But as someone who might be able to lead a forum, it would be a chance to hear from people directly that are speaking to me about these concerns.
Got it. I'm gonna start closing it out. I had asked, out in public forums, go figure, on Facebook, and I said, hey, do you have any questions for the candidates? I got some great responses. One of them was from a girl who I consider a Facebook friend at this point, Krista. She asked a great question last year, and it absolutely changed the game in terms of she wanted to get more Narcan out on the streets. And Dan Wood locally helped her do that with the chief of police, and it was incredible. So I feel like if I can ask a single question that's going to help these folks, I'm always going to ask it. And she had the same question last year, but getting Narcan out there and education's one thing, but her question is, our area has no detox or affordable inpatient treatment for substance abuse. With the fentanyl epidemic at an all-time high, is there a way to get detox in our community? Because you have to drive over 2 hours with no guarantee you're going to get seen. How could Kate Creech help us get that process going?
Sure. I think that comes down to funding. I think that comes down to taking that to the state house and making that a serious priority and highlighting that as an issue where we have to figure out how to turn this into action. There, there's funding that we can create or funding that is there to be able to have facilities like this, because that is a very serious issue. It also impacts our homeless population. No one should be experiencing this. And if they are, we need to be able to be there on the ground to supply the help that they need. Because yes, you can have Narcan on the streets, you can do the training, but people, like you're saying, need to have somewhere to go. So I think at a state level, those leaders, that's something that we could all work together. This means across the aisle to come up with a solution to be able to fund a facility that would be able to provide this care for these people who really, really do need our help.
Yeah, I think any kind of advocacy, no matter what your viewpoint is to help these people. They're sick.
Mhm.
It's almost like an act of terrorism in my mind, the way that everything's laced with fentanyl. You can't do anything anymore. Nothing that was even recreationally, air quotes, safe is no longer
Yeah.
safe. It's
And you think
terrible.
about our youth, you think about
Yeah.
our youth and what they're exposed to and the serious implications of what could happen if they were to be exposed to that. And also, I mean, the way that fentanyl works and that it is a dermal thing. So if you go to try to help someone, then you risk being exposed to it yourself. So
Yep.
that's the education part, I think, first and foremost, really, really needs to be pushed. But then also finding a way to have facilities here, because you should not have to drive 2 hours away to get the help you need. Absolutely
Not at
not.
all. Nope. Oh, I appreciate you answering that question. One more question. You can see my hoodie here. It says "Built with Integrity" on it. Okay, that's our
I
motto
love
at
that.
Bluffton Builders. That's our tagline.
Yeah.
We were in construction, built with integrity. It makes sense, and I started realizing I started living it as my filter, and I started living it as my way of life, and decision making processes all came through is this built with integrity. So I'd like to ask you, Kate, how are you built with integrity?
I think I'm built with integrity because I'm not afraid to speak my mind and share my truths about my own experiences. I'm not afraid to be vulnerable and speak to people about some issues that we haven't necessarily covered but are very pressing in our state that impact everyone. So, as far as my integrity, I really do hold myself in high regard for that because I'm an honest person. I'm an empathetic person. I'm someone who will humble myself. If I think one way and then someone presents another point of view, I can humble myself in order to listen to where they're coming from. Because, like I said earlier, if everyone's wrong, no one's right. So, having a true sense of integrity and being able to sometimes wear your heart on your sleeve to speak up and speak out for everyone is something that I hold very true to heart.
I appreciate that.
Mhm.
Anything else you want to say to the people before we finish up here?
Yes, there is something. Some people will say that it's up to us to solve our own problems. Um, I think as a leader, it is actually up to those leaders to help you solve your problems. But if you look what's happened, especially during the past legislative session in South Carolina, there are laws that are being passed that don't give us the opportunity to really solve our problems. It's creating even more. So I am the person that does not expect you to solve those yourself. I'm the person that's going to be a voice for you. And I'm going to take that to the state house. I'm going to speak for justice. Something that Michael B. Moore has said that I love so much is I'm the candidate for common sense, not nonsense. I'm here to listen, and I'd really appreciate your vote. Early voting has started. The lines are still crazy. I was running an errand today and drove down Ulmer Road, and the cars are just lined up down the street. So that's really exciting for voter turnout. It just as a reminder, it goes through November 2nd. It's of course closed Sunday the 27th, and you can vote at any of the early voting areas until election day. People need to remember this. Once it comes down to election day, you have to vote in your precinct. A really easy way to figure out where your precinct is go to sevotes.org. You type in your information and it tells you exactly where you need to vote if you wait until election day. Of course, I'm encouraging everyone not to do that.
Mhm.
Go ahead and get out and vote. And if you want to vote, if you care about our environment, if you care about our public schools and our teachers, if you care about bodily autonomy, if you care about public safety, I am the candidate that is going to be that person for you and be a voice and be a true support. So I would really appreciate your vote for House District 120.
Kate, that was awesome. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity and your time. Have a good one.
Absolutely. You too. Take care.